This has been such an exciting conference, and I really appreciate the organizers, the speakers, attendees, in person, online, everybody for being here and making this possible, so thank you. We have one final substantive session, and then we'll go straight into the conclusion and then straight into the reception. So we are officially nearing the end, but this is a pivotal final session where we take everything that we discussed about the emerging science of animal consciousness, and then we apply it to public policy. Because of course, this is a slowly developing field, much more rapidly in the recent years, but generally speaking, slowly. We need to learn more about the science of animal consciousness gradually over time, and yet, as several of our speakers and several of our audience members have noted, humans are interacting with quadrillions of non-human animals every year, captive and wild, and so we face difficult questions. We need to decide how to treat these animals, including animals of uncertain consciousness and sentience, even when the science is continuing. We need to decide how to treat them here and now. And so we will have two speakers who can give us the lay of the land when it comes to public policy regarding our interactions with non-human animals at global and local scales, and then we can all have a conversation together about how to take the science that we have discussed today, how to take these policy paradigms, and how to bridge them and move forward with the science and the policy. So I am very excited to introduce these final two speakers, starting with Cleo Verkouw. Cleo is a scientist at the Stockholm Environment Institute, an international research institute on sustainable development, and a visiting fellow at the Brooks McCormick Animal Law and Policy Program at Harvard Law School. Over the past decade, she has worked closely with the UN system, researching international climate change, sustainable development and food systems policy, and the consideration of animals within these frameworks. She has co-led 3 major UN reports, including a recent UN Environment Program report on alternative proteins that discusses the environmental, health, socioeconomic, and animal welfare implications of novel meat and dairy alternatives. So please join me in welcoming Cleo Verkouw.
Thank you, Jeff. Sadly, I do not spend my work days working with charismatic fauna, and so I'll spare you the slides of my Zoom calls and boring gray meeting rooms. But it's so great to be here with you all today. I'm very excited about the conference as a whole and also about the declaration that has come out of it. I've actually felt this need to have a short, concise, policy-relevant documents to be able to point policymakers to in conversations about animal consciousness, sentience, and the implications for how we treat animals. And I've been asked to say a little bit about the relevance of new insights into animal consciousness for policy. I'll do so especially from an international perspective, which is the space I work in, but want to just start by acknowledging how important this topic is for all levels of governance. So obviously, national governments have competencies across so many different issue areas that affect animals, including animals farmed for food, animals used for testing, animals used for entertainment or art, wild animals, or animals with whom we otherwise share our environments, such as urban mammals, birds, and insects. So all these interactions can be informed by evolving insights into animal consciousness, as well as into the ethical implications thereof. Jonathan Birch and his team's work in the UK that led to invertebrate animals, including octopuses, crabs, and lobsters, being included in the UK government's Sentience Bill, is such a valuable demonstration of how science in this area can inform policy. As we'll discuss in this panel too, local governments can play a really important role in how we engage with other animals. Still, I think there's value in highlighting the role that international policy can play in this conversation as well, and it's an issue that has received, I think, less attention. So in these brief remarks, I'd like to briefly explain why I think it's worth engaging with international policy around animal consciousness. Then I'll discuss 3 international policy processes that I think are particularly relevant in this regard. And I'll close with some short reflections on what could help move consideration of animals forward in the international policy space. So why is international policy relevant for animals? I think the first reason relates to the specific role that the UN can fulfill. Obviously, the UN is member state driven. It has a lot of shortcomings. It's very politicized. But despite these shortcomings, UN policy still plays an important role in international norm setting and setting expectations about what kind of conduct is appropriate. We've seen that in areas such as human rights protection and climate action, the UN has actually played a leading role in emphasizing how important these norms are. UN policy also helps inform international funding decisions, so there's a direct sort of financial link to some of this norm-setting work as well. And the UN also plays an important role in supporting scientific assessments and collecting and disseminating data, which seems highly relevant to our present discussions. The second reason that international policy is relevant for animals, I think, relates to the specific timing of this moment. I'll talk about that a bit more in a second, but we're in a unique moment in how animal welfare relates to UN Sustainable Development Policy. So there is a window of opportunity right now in the coming years, but it's also a window that might close. And the third reason for focusing more, I think, on how animals and the UN system interrelate is that there's just a lot of low-hanging fruit surrounding that issue. Animals' interests have just generally received very little attention in UN policy, so there are opportunities for progress that can likely be achieved with relatively limited time or financial investments. Which types of processes are particularly important to pay attention to? I think there's quite a few, but I'd like to highlight three distinct but interrelated processes that I see as particularly relevant for considering the interests of animals in UN policy. The first is the UN Sustainable Development Process. So in 2015, here in New York, the world's governments adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This global sustainable development agenda consists of 17 goals and 169 targets, which are pretty ambitious in their scope and what they set out to do. But they currently do not mention animal welfare in a meaningful way. They talk about a lot of social, economic, environmental issues, and they talk about issues related to nature conservation and biodiversity. But we know that that's not the same thing as considering the welfare of individual animals, and that in some cases, there's actual tensions between, for instance, biodiversity policy and animal welfare. You could poison or otherwise kill an entire species to preserve another species, for instance, or the raising of animals in captivity for reasons of biodiversity conservation could also raise welfare challenges. So the fact that animal welfare is not mentioned at all across all these goals and targets is a problem. But I think there are some indications that the UN system might be more open to considering these issues in future. So in 2019, the UN Global Sustainable Development Report highlighted animal welfare as a key missing issue in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And in 2022, the UN Environment Assembly, which is a coming together of all the world's environment ministers, adopted a resolution that requires the UN Environment Programme to produce a report on the nexus between the environment, animal welfare, and sustainable development. So conversations that are happening at this conference are really highly relevant for this type of scientific assessment that the UN has been asked to produce. It can help inform the scope of species that are given consideration in this report, and also what to do in the face of scientific uncertainty around these issues. In addition, a new post-2030 development agenda is expected to emerge in the coming years and will need to be adopted in 2030. Once that agenda is set, it will be locked in until 2045. At least that's the timelines that the UN has been operating on with these agendas. So there is really this sort of 5-year window to help influence policy developments and consideration of animals within this agenda. The second promising avenue is conversations related to One Health. So One Health is an approach that recognizes the interlinkages between human, animal, and environmental health, and the need for policy to consider these interlinkages together. And amongst other things, and in part because of the scare that emerged from COVID-19, the UN has established a global advisory panel on One Health called the One Health High-Level Expert Panel. And 4 international organizations have been mandated to take work forward in this area, including supporting development of national One Health plans. The One Health High-Level Expert Panel has, importantly, explicitly acknowledged the need for solutions that recognize the importance of animal welfare. So in my view, this creates one of the most promising and direct inroads to be talking about the needs of animals within these policy spaces. At the same time, it's important to underscore that the concept of One Health is by no means fully accepted by governments internationally. There's pushback from some member states who, perhaps rightly, are worried about the additional financial burdens that taking such an approach will entail, especially for lower income countries. But it does really represent an opportunity to discuss how animal welfare is considered in One Health approaches, how ambitiously animal welfare is defined, but also the scope of animals that are considered in this regard, and research on animal consciousness can help us with that. The third relevant development that I'd like to highlight is that of international climate change policy, and we already had a question about it in the previous slot. So climate policy is one area of sustainable development policy that is really forging ahead. Every government is taking some kind of climate action, even though we're still not nearly where we need to be. And the food system especially is receiving a lot more scrutiny than it was even 5 years ago. So action in this space is very much needed, but we're also seeing examples where such action might clash with animal welfare concerns. One area that I think we're seeing that is a recent publication by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, which published a roadmap for a 1.5 degree compatible food system. And some of the recommendations they make there include shifting from beef to chicken consumption to reduce emissions, but also increasing aquaculture by at least 75% by 2040, with very little specificity about what kind of animal species would or should be involved in that, and no mention of potential animal welfare implications. So I think there's enormous risks there, that governments are forging ahead with climate policies, that the path of least resistance is often to continue to invest in existing sectors, but also to create potential new sectors or scale those up, such as that of insect farming. And so the moment there, too, is now to engage in some of these processes and at least raise concerns about animal consciousness related to such developments. In climate policy, there are other areas as well, including interventions related to infrastructure, both for climate mitigation and adaptation reasons. So I think it's generally just a very important space to be watching, and what the implications of these are for animals. So these are just 3 processes I wanted to briefly highlight, but there are other highly relevant ones as well, including the international biodiversity process, and discussion around compassionate conservation that are happening within these types of international negotiations, as well as the standard setting work of the World Organization for Animal Health. I'll close with some observations on what I think is needed to give this issue the impetus it deserves. So firstly, I think it's very important to bring science into these conversations. It's really quite hard to understate the very important role that science has played at an international level in informing international environmental governance around the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis. There are standalone big scientific assessments that happen in these areas. And science has played a crucial role here. Not just an agenda-taking one, but really an agenda-setting one in terms of highlighting what governments should be paying attention to. And I think UN scientific assessments and political processes in these areas I mentioned, including sustainable development, climate change, One Health, biodiversity, are all opportunities to highlight the relevance of animal welfare to these issues, including advancements in our understanding of animal consciousness. A second consideration that I'd like to mention is the need for international support and collaboration. If we are starting to ask the international community to increase their attention to animal welfare-related concerns, that also means considering the type of international support that can help lower-income countries consider these issues and grapple with them, including, for instance, through building up capacity of different scientists who can then also play a role in informing policies in their own countries. I think what's also really important to underscore here is that this type of international collaboration is not a one-way street. Obviously, high-income countries haven't completely figured out how to live sustainably, equitably, and with sufficient regard for animal ethics. So they probably have a lot to learn from other approaches and worldviews in that regard. And here I'd like to sort of just suggest that we should be open to the possibility that there may also be limitations to what a framing around consciousness is able to achieve, right? For many of the animals that are quite central to our food system, there's like pigs and cows, there's not necessarily that much debate about their consciousness or levels of consciousness, and still we might treat them very badly. So an understanding of consciousness is very valuable and can really help expand the scope of animals that we consider morally relevant, but it's not sufficient to ensure that we treat them well. And so I think it will be important to consider the value of other framings, potentially sort of that can complement a focus on consciousness, including rights of nature approaches around animal dignity, which might resonate with other stakeholders or stakeholders in different parts of the world. It seems valuable to be open and curious and humble about these different lenses and what they can bring to this discussion. And finally, inputting and informing these processes obviously needs more research, as we saw here, that some species really haven't been examined very much at all, and our understanding is limited. But I'd also suggest that we need a lot more interdisciplinary collaboration and expertise. It's really wonderful to see people here from the humanities and the natural sciences and the social sciences gathered together, and we still can be doing more to go beyond our disciplines to help shape policy. So I'm coming to a close, but just to recap, international policy does matter for these issues, and there are different opportunities to get involved. But of course, we also need to be realistic about the challenges involved. Internationally and nationally, we are at a time of significant global instability, polarization, and it's very easy to see how vulnerable groups, including animals, can be left behind in this context. One unfortunate development in the EU was the fact that policymakers have significantly delayed commitments to update animal welfare legislation, for instance. I don't think there are easy answers to these challenges, but it does make the scientific work that is being done here all the more important. I thank you all for bringing a voice to the voiceless in these conversations. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that, Cleo. And then our final speaker today is Katrina Wyman, the Wilf Family Professor of Property Law at NYU School of Law, where she teaches and researches in the areas of property, urban environmental law, and natural resources law, among other subjects. Katrina is co-faculty director of NYU Law's Frank J. Guarini Center on Environmental, Energy, and Land Use Law, and faculty director of the law school's LLM program in Environmental and Energy Law. She was awarded the Podell Distinguished Teaching Award in 2020. She has a BA, MA, LLB from the University of Toronto, and an LLM from Yale Law School. So please join me in welcoming Katrina Wyman.
So thank you so much, Jeff. And Jeff forgot to mention my most important credential for this is that I have been teaching a reading group for several years with Jeff, where we've talked about a lot of issues related to animals, environmental law, and food law and policy. So Jeff has really been a very important tutor to me in many of the issues that you've been discussing today. So thank you very much for including me in this event. And I am going to talk about three things. So Jeff asked me to talk about, well, how could you transfer some of the scientific findings that you've been talking about today into policy at the local government level. So that'll be my main focus. I'm going to talk first about, well, why would you think about transferring some of these ideas into policy at the local level? Why focus on the local level? We just heard about the international level. Now we're kind of like going to the other end of the spectrum. And then I'll talk a bit about some ways to incorporate some of these ideas into policy at the local level. And third, I want to talk briefly about the importance of not stopping at the local level within the nation state, to just see the local level as like a starting point and then to scale up. Okay, so first of all, why think about incorporating some of these ideas into policy, into law at the local level? So one reason I think to start at the local level is that city governments are often more open to newer ideas than higher levels of government. They're often more progressive. That has to do with the nature of urban populations and the urban-rural divide that we've read so much about. So city governments, for political reasons, may be more welcoming of some of the ideas and findings you've been discussing today. Second reason would be that there are many wild animals, many animals that live in cities and urban environments who could benefit from changes in policy and infrastructure at the local level. A third reason would be that city governments own a lot of land. So they can make a big difference on the lands that they own directly, just by changes in policy at the local level, without necessarily having to get new local legislation even through. You can potentially make changes in lands that are parks, that are streets, that are sidewalks. That's a lot of actually land mass within cities. Fourth, city governments often regulate privately owned lands and buildings within their borders. In fact, that's often at the core of local government authority, is really regulation of land use and buildings. And you can potentially do a lot to improve conditions for animals, improve animal welfare through changes to on privately owned lands and buildings. Okay, now there are some limits to what you can do at the local level, and I'm going to set some of these out now, in part to foreshadow what I'll be saying about the importance of not stopping at the local level and to kind of scale up and move to hopefully make changes as well, whether it be at the state level in the US or at the national level. One of the limits of starting at the local level, which we've seen in the climate policy context that was just referred to, is that local governments have very small geographic jurisdiction. And they also tend to have pretty limited legal jurisdiction. So there are whole areas, whole swaths of life, like a lot of energy policy, for example, that local governments typically have no role in, which could be very important for if you want to improve animal welfare. A second limitation of action at the local level is that there's often very limited analytical capacity at the local level. So it's sort of paradoxical in a way. I'm saying to you, well, the local level may be more open to ideas about animal consciousness, but at the same time, paradoxically, you're not going to have offices full of many scientists who can really read through a lot of scientific papers and absorb those findings. So you have much more limited resources at the local level. Okay, so that could inhibit the extent to which you can actually get some of these findings actually translated into policy in any kind of sophisticated way. Local governments often also have very limited budgets, and they're often going to be politically responsive to the humans who vote in local elections or who participate in the local electoral process. So all of that is to say there's opportunities at the local level, but you have to also be mindful of the limitations of acting at the local level, which we've definitely seen in the climate context. Okay, so let me talk now about some options for incorporating improvements to wild animal welfare at the local level. So here I'm going to actually draw on a report that Jeff's Wild Animal Welfare Program and the center that I head, the Guarini Center, actually recently released, called the Wild Animal Welfare and Local Policies on Land Use and the Built Environment. We released this earlier this spring, and actually the lead author was excellent legal fellow Alyssa White. So in this policy brief, essentially, or report, we basically identified sort of, I would call, two categories of changes you could make at the local level. One is a set of cross-cutting initiatives that you could make, that you might introduce at the local level that would kind of affect decision-making and planning kind of across broad swaths of local government activity. And the second category of policy changes are kind of much more sector-specific. So let me give you some example of some of the cross-cutting initiatives through which that could provide an entry point for increasing consideration of animal welfare. Many cities have planning processes, so they will often have local climate action plans that they produce every few years, itemizing ideas for, addressing climate change. They may also have land use plans that they periodically produce. Some cities have a comprehensive plan. New York doesn't really have a comprehensive land use plan, but does sort of planning periodically. You can use these planning processes to integrate ideas for improving animal welfare. So in your local climate plans, you can actually, there are ideas, some of which I'll mention in a few minutes, that can address both, help to limit greenhouse gas emissions while also improving the urban environment for animals and for humans as well. Okay, so some of the things we identify in this report really fall into that category. A second sort of cross-cutting thing you can do at the local level, in addition to thinking about incorporating wild animal welfare into these kind of planning processes, is you can think about incorporating wild animal welfare into environmental assessment processes. So you may have heard about the National Environmental Policy Act, which is a federal statute in the US, and there's often a version of it in many countries that requires the government or a private actor to undertake an environmental assessment when they're proposing an action that will significantly affect the environment. So some cities also have a kind of environmental assessment requirement. And you could seek to amend the environmental assessment statute, or maybe just the implementing regulations, to require consideration of animal welfare when, for example, the city government or another actor is proposing some kind of major change to the land use environment. A third sort of cross-cutting initiative would be to introduce or to establish at the local level an Office of Animal Welfare. In New York City, there is now a city animal welfare office. In Amsterdam, there's a counselor for animal welfare. So that kind of institutional body, it might not appear to have that much power. It might be playing more of a coordination function, or it might be more of a champion. But it does provide some kind of institutionalization for concern about animal welfare. And as you're trying to change norms, that kind of institutionalization, to have a spokesperson, like the Lorax, for those of you who remember the Lorax, you could have sort of like the Lorax who speaks for animal welfare in the local policy-making process. Okay? So those are some examples of cross-cutting changes that you can make. There's also many types of kind of sector-specific policies you can make, and I'm not going to go through all of the various ideas that Alyssa collected and in the report, Alyssa and others collected in the report. But I'll just give you an example of a few kind of sector-specific policies that you can implement at the local level. One would be to develop green corridors, and in developing green corridors and streets and sidewalks, to think about connectivity for animal movement, not just human movement, and not just the bikes. that humans want to use, but for animals as well. A second idea would be in thinking about building infrastructure in the city, to think about the implications of the infrastructure for animals as well, and to adjust the infrastructure to address the needs of animals. So those are some of you may have walked around Lower Manhattan recently and noticed that a lot of Lower Manhattan by the coastline is being dug up because the city's engaged in various climate resilience projects. I have no idea, but it might be interesting to find out to what extent in planning those resiliency projects did they take into account individual animal welfare. Then there's other things you can do at the local level that would be more focused on buildings. You can do things like require bird-safe building materials to be incorporated into the construction of new buildings or reconstructed buildings, renovated buildings. Or you can think about lights-only policies as well in buildings, not only for city-owned buildings, but potentially for privately owned buildings as well. So there are various things, these are just some examples of policies you could implement potentially at the local level. Now, just as I just foreshadowing what I said at the outset, that you can't stop at the local level. I would see the local level as a kind of accessible place to start in incorporating consideration of animal welfare. But you don't want to stop there. You want to scale it up. That's got to be your kind of ultimate objective if you really want to make change in this area. Okay, and so why might you want to move to a higher level of government? In some sense, it's very intuitive. You want the wider spatial scale for your policies. You want more animal welfare to be protected than you can protect at the individual city level. Another advantage of higher levels of government, you're going to get more serious analytic capacity often. There you are going to find more scientists who can absorb and actually think about and incorporate scientific research into policy making compared with the local level. And there's more legal jurisdiction. So in the United States, the major environmental statutes are at the federal level. The Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, all of these major environmental laws that could potentially be levers for improving animal welfare are at the federal level. Okay? So what could you do at the federal level? Again, at the federal level, you could seek to incorporate animal welfare into the environmental assessment process and environmental impact statement process under the National Environmental Policy Act. There's a great paper that somebody who's about to be a law professor, Natalie Jasowitz, wrote a paper very recently about how you're already seeing some federal agencies in the US start to think a bit about a reference animal welfare in some of these environmental assessments and environmental impact statements that they're required to do under the National Environmental Policy Act. You could really try to spread that and mainstream that. A second idea would be to think about incorporating animal welfare into cost-benefit analysis at the federal level, which is an idea that Andy Stavos, who's a fellow currently at NYU at the law school, is proposed in a paper that's available online. You might want to do that because cost-benefit analysis is hugely significant for the regulatory process in the US context at the federal level. So those are just, and then the third thing you might want to do at the federal level is take advantage of the fact that the federal government is a huge landowner in the US context. It owns 28% of the land mass. And so you can influence wild animal welfare in particular by changing the land use plans of major landowning and land managing agencies at the federal level, like the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management. So there are a lot of reasons then to not stop at the local level and to seek to scale up over time. Eleanor Ostrom, the late political scientist, advocated a multi-scalar approach to addressing climate change, and I think you would also want a multi-scalar approach, looking at the local, the state, the federal, the international level, as you seek to improve animal welfare. So, thank you.
All right, Thank you so much, Cleo and Katrina. We now have a little bit of time for discussion, so Cleo, if you would be willing to come back up. And as we have been doing with other panels, I thought I would start with just a simple question posed to both of our panelists, which is targeted at bringing together the trends in animal welfare policy at the global and local levels that they discussed with the emerging science of animal consciousness material that other panels have discussed. And what other panels have claimed to establish, and what the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness itself asserts, is that, okay, the scientific evidence supports attributions of consciousness to mammals and birds, and then beyond that, it supports a realistic possibility of consciousness in all vertebrates and many invertebrates. And so the question is, what kinds of tools or frameworks do policymakers have available for grappling with representation of animals of uncertain consciousness or uncertain sentience? How should policymakers consider welfare risks for animals who have a realistic possibility of being conscious given the evidence available?
Go ahead.
So when I first read the declaration, I don't think you specifically use these words, but I was reminded of the precautionary principle, right? That is quite widespread in environmental law and policy, but also health, consumer protection, food policy. And the idea of that is when there are significant risks or risks that cannot be overturned, that it's important to proceed with caution. And that's been really quite a significant way of thinking about environmental risk, both internationally. I think that's how we started thinking about climate change initially. You know, we didn't have all the science together. We didn't know exactly what would happen. But given the significant and irreversible potential of risk, governments took that very seriously. And I think there's parallels with the ways we treat animals, right? The risks of harm are both very significant and for many of these animals is irreversible. And so using that framework to think about what do we do in the face of scientific uncertainty, I think is very valuable. I think that's something that might also resonate with policymakers because they're used to taking this approach in different areas. But I also think it's a very contested approach, right? Because even once you've agreed that such a precautionary approach is necessary, there's always this discussion of, okay, what is the harm of inaction, right? And in the case of health interventions or certain environmental interventions like geoengineering or GMO crops, like advocates of some of these types of approaches might say, you know, the harm of inaction is actually greater or very significant as well. And people might make similar arguments when it comes to animals in our food system, them being necessary for food security, for instance, or animals used for testing being medically essential. So I think these things would be contested, and the precautionary principle kind of doesn't resolve that tension, but it raises at least this question and sort of shifts the burden of proof as well, that people need to prove that there will be no harm rather than people are only trying to show that there is harm. So I definitely think it's promising as sort of a starting point for conversations and bringing stakeholders together.
Thank you. Katrina?
Yeah, so I think that I agree with you what you just said at the end there, that the precautionary principle is a useful principle to have in mind. And certainly, you know, in debates, when I first started teaching 2 decades ago, there was a lot of discussion of the precautionary principle as, you know, providing a basis for taking action to address climate change. I'm not, so I have nothing against it. I just am not sure that you necessarily need to invoke it. When I think about U.S. environmental law, the precautionary principle, it's not like expressly on the face of many U.S. environmental statutes. I mean, the ideas are underpinning these statutes, okay? But they're not. It's not like a magic 2 words that are going to get you automatically to first base. And I think I also think the other thing to keep in mind is that policymakers in the environmental context, in many contexts, are used to dealing with uncertainty. They deal with, they're making decisions under conditions of uncertainty all the time. Uncertainty about what will be the costs of things they might undertake. Financially, what will be which populations of people, of animals might be affected. So I don't, I think, and how, and my kind of casual observation is that how they respond, how they act in the face of this uncertainty is often influenced by people's norms and values. And I'm not sure that this uncertainty is a new problem. It's maybe a new problem as in, you're bringing it up in a new context, perhaps, for people, for decision makers, but I think it's really, so I think part of what needs to be done here is kind of consciousness raising, in a way, of policymakers.
Great, thank you so much. We now have a little bit of time for questions. I see a hand right here, near the left.
Hi, thank you so much for your talks. My name's Lena. I have a related question. We've been talking about building spaces for scientific uncertainty, and I wonder if, in characterizing the uncertainty as a scientific matter and not as philosophical uncertainty or uncertainty in our meta-ethical commitments or metaphysical commitments, might risk imposing or presupposing a certain theory of consciousness, and it being something empirically determinable and maybe disaggregatable into units that are comparable, rather than our uncertainty being a product of not figuring out our underlying meta-ethical commitments. Just might be, imposing a certain view, especially in these international governance spaces.
You want to?
No, I think it's a great question, and I sort of tried to get at that a little bit in what I was saying, right? That I don't think we have it figured out across so many areas, and speaking for UN policy, right? Like, we're still grappling with so many questions, and clearly there's something in sort of our worldview and the way the dominant sort of economic model is engaging with the world that is quite harmful. And I also think that different policymakers and different individuals are just receptive to very different types of arguments, right? And so in the UN space, I think what's helpful to highlight is how our treatment of animals currently is actually a risk for our sustainable development, right? The way we treat animals in our food system, for instance, is bad for the climate, bad for biodiversity loss, it's really bad for public health. And so that's sort of one way to appeal to policymakers' sort of interests is highlighting those types of risks. I think generally that there are other governments that are very susceptible to more of the sort of consciousness framing, and the UK government seems to be one that is really taking that approach on board. So I think it's important to be flexible in this, and therefore also opening up this type of space, right? Because we do have a lot to learn from other disciplines and other parts of the world here, and eventually that can help further some of these goals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree with what you say. I mean, I would guess I would just underscore a point that you made that, kind of low, and the easiest thing to do, I think, at the local level and perhaps in any policy context, is to show the policymaker that humans care about the impacts on animal welfare. That's sort of like the thing that they can, I think, most easily incorporate into policy making, is that this is the impact on animal welfare is having an impact on humans. I think it's another step that'll be harder to take to get just animal welfare independently be considered. And that's, of course, where we would want to go. But I think at the outset, it's going to be easier. And it's amazing how little now just the impacts on humans of effects on animal welfare are considered in policy making. But that's an easy first step.
Yeah. Okay, great. Wow, a lot of questions. How about we go right over there? Yes.
So,
hold on just a second.
But what I thought I heard was that the UN was planning to set a goal of increasing animal agriculture by 75%, and somehow this would mitigate climate change. And so I either would like you to explain how I misheard or explain the reasoning behind that.
Yeah, sorry. So the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, it's also it's important to distinguish between different UN entities because at the moment they're taking different approaches to this issue. So they developed this roadmap. It's one of 3 roadmaps. This one is a global one, and they will develop regional and national roadmaps for the food system, for making it both compatible with addressing food security as well as limiting climate change. The growth I referred to was in aquaculture. So they want to see, or they propose that a 75% increase, at least, in aquaculture by 2040 could help meet climate goals. And I guess implicit there is this assumption that we'd be shifting away from larger land animals, ruminant animals, towards aquatic animals. But yeah, that's the goal. And in general, it's worth taking a look at the roadmap because they propose 120 interventions, and none of them directly refer to reducing meat consumption or animal protein consumption, even in regions that currently consume a lot of that. So that has been challenged by scientists already, yeah.
Yeah, and this is the risk when animal welfare is left out of the conversation. If everything is reduced to, for example, land use change, deforestation, climate change, obviously this is important, but then you risk having these proposals to switch from extensive systems to intensive ones, or switch from large animals to small ones, or switch from land animals to aquatic animals to mitigate the land use requirements in a way that then might exacerbate animal welfare costs, or for that matter, global health costs, antimicrobial resistance, and the emergent diseases, and so on and so forth. So this is why we need to consider welfare and health and environmental impacts holistically. Do we have any other questions? Yes, right there.
Hi, I'm Gabriella. I'm with Sentient Media. I'm a journalist, just putting that out there. So my question kind of has to do with the roadmap as well, but first, how exactly can the declaration be used for policymaking? I think I just want to clarify that. Is it something for people just to point to? And if so, are there some faults with that? Because, you know, with the roadmap itself, there was the researchers that came out and said that it fails to meet, talk about plant-based meat. Sorry, that it fails to talk about plant-based meat. And then, you know, there was a Harvard paper that 200 researchers signed on to that, again, said, like, we need to reduce the amount of livestock that we use. So I kind of see that similar where I guess now 100 people have signed on to this declaration. Mm-hmm. So how realistic and how can this declaration be used?
I mean, I think the declaration could be used by advocates in particular, who are seeking to advance policies at any level of government. Really, it's kind of and then it's kind of emphasizing that there's a scientific foundation for some of the policy changes that they might be seeking. I think in government, how could a government could use it as a starting point for actually trying to understand some of the scientific research that the declaration is underscoring exists. But I see it as a potential powerful tool for advocates myself as a starting point. Yeah.
I agree with that. And I would add that certainly at the international level, I just think that scientists generally play a really important role. You know, in the UN climate negotiations, there's a whole sort of research and independent major group that attends these talks and sort of tries to inform them. Scientists obviously play a big role in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as well as international biodiversity assessments. So science is taken quite seriously, even though it's also, you know, political, and sometimes you can't say exactly what you'd like to say because you have to deal with the politics and political sensitivities. But I think with something like this declaration, in addition to advocates using it, that scientists could potentially be quite proactive in terms of sort of approaching the relevant forums at local, national, international level. Certainly speaking from the international perspective, I just think these conversations aren't happening very much, but if a bunch of scientists brings it to the table, governments will sort of be required to respond and think about it. And I think civil society, NGOs, are already doing this important work, sort of highlighting the linkages between sustainable development and animal welfare. But on this specific topic, the scientific community has not engaged so much at the international level. So again, when I was talking about low-hanging fruit, I think there's potential here that hasn't been explored very much.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Johannes. Is this on? Yeah. Thanks for the event. Thanks for the wonderful input. So here's a question which really derives from my own sort of tension in between. So on the one hand, we're scientists and we're supposed to operate independently of norms or what we think is right or wrong. So we're just supposed to find truth to some extent about consciousness in animals. On the other hand, there's this very important dimension of taking action and trying to enforce change. So my question would be, to which extent the UN or local bodies expect scientists to implement these actions or to drive this change?
I don't know that there's one answer to that. I don't think there's one answer to that question. I think when I think about US environmental law, and here I'm thinking more about federal environmental law, because I think there's often more of a use of science at the federal level in environmental law than there would be, say, at the local level, where you wouldn't have the analytic capacity to really fully incorporate science. I think, you know, some environmental laws will specifically require scientific findings for an agency to undertake some kind of action. And so there, science is playing a very important role. It's a predicate. There's got to be some kind of risk assessment before some action will be undertaken. It's a predicate to action. But often the environmental statute will not say that the action that gets to be undertaken is to be determined solely based on the science. There'll be other factors weighed in the mix. So I think in the policy process, science, which I think that's kind of your question, what is the role of science in the environmental policy context in the US? It plays different roles. Partly it is about bringing attention to issues, to policymakers, but partly it's kind of also sometimes just one factor in the mix, you know, in deciding what will be done, what will be the action. But I think historically, you know, scientific findings have really driven a lot of new policy developments in the environmental area. It's really changes in understanding that come from scientific research that led to the appreciation, say, of climate change. And I think it's very powerful to sort of bring together a body of research and say, well, there is this body of research. And it's also, I think, a good statement to say there's more certainty in this area than there is in this area. It enhances the credibility. Okay, and that is bringing some new issues to the attention of policymakers.
Can I maybe add? I guess I have views on that. I work for an organization that, like, its motto is bridging science and policy. And I think it's really important, first of all, because scientists are in some cases some of the first people who actually realize there's a problem we need to be dealing with, right? And I think it's quite easy if you work in science to sort of, you know, it's obviously a lot of work. You have all these competing priorities. The incentive structure might, you know, be pushing you in one direction. But I really don't think we can expect, if you write an academic paper, that the right policymaker will necessarily read it, right, at the right time. And so, especially with topics like these that have so many ethical implications, actually, I personally feel there's so much value and maybe even responsibility to try and get these findings into policy relevant conversations as well. But I'm not saying it's easy, and I think the sort of interdisciplinary conversations, but also organizations like ours trying to facilitate those types of conversations can be very helpful, because of recognizing all the competing priorities that scientists face.
We have time for one more question with apologies to everybody else. Go for it.
Hi, thanks so much. I really liked Lena's point earlier about the assumptions. Part of it is I'm also thinking that in humans, affect and consciousness is a mess. We actually put a collaboration together on it's called the human affectome, precisely because of this, that the assumptions are a complete mess. We don't even know how to get that across, and is emotion even conscious? Who knows? Also, sorry, small anecdote, then I will ask the real question. But I was just on the WHO site like last week, and I was appalled because I was looking through the topics, and it goes addiction, dementia, brain health, as if it's separate. Brain health is separate from all these other topics that are brain health related. How do academics engage at the level of the UN? Yes, there can be facilitation. Is there another way that there can be a more structured research agenda so that we can sort our assumptions and help that like get to policy in a way that's like, yeah, just a bit more direct? Right now, it does feel like it's, I grew up in a UN family, and so I kind of like was like, oh, I don't want to engage. I went to academia to not engage, but now I'm like, oh, maybe I want to engage. But yeah, what are the different levels at which there can be engagement, I guess? Yeah.
That's it. Why don't you go?
Well, I agree with your sort of observation that it's not particularly structural or well organized, right? I think often sort of policy opportunities present themselves. Sometimes it's quite random. Sometimes it's because one government decided this was a good idea, or the timing just worked out. I think it would be nice if it were more logical, but at the moment I don't think that's the reality. And as far as I can tell, in terms of the capacity of different groups to be engaging in these processes, even just being reactive to, there's an international biodiversity assessments coming out, or international climate change assessments coming out. There's opportunities there, for instance, to register either as an author, which is a heavy lift and maybe not the exact sort of focus of most people here. But you can also register to be a reviewer of these types of assessments, and then you could highlight, this issue is missing or that issue is missing. And in terms of, I don't think we'll necessarily find scientific consensus or one message to come out from the scientific community, right? But sort of the role of these processes, which are very intergovernmental, require various rounds of interactions between scientists and then policymakers, that together will sort of come to some kind of semblance of consensus, or at least, key messages that are relevant for policymakers. I don't know if that's a helpful answer. I think it's messy, but I think there's definitely enough opportunities to be a lot more engaged than we currently are.
I mean, just in the domestic context, I think there's various ways for scientists to sort of play a role in the policy process. So one is reactive. So often when agencies or governments are proposing regulations or proposing projects, there's an opportunity to comment. So you can file comments, attaching academic articles. You can go to public meetings and make statements, okay? You can also try to join some of these government agencies. You could act as an employee. Agencies do hire scientists, especially at the federal level. You can and also write reports that are more accessible. So that's probably a role that you're kind of playing in a way, in translating for policymakers, scientific research into more tangible, shorter policy briefs, okay? People can also write op-eds. There's a lot of ways that people can engage and have an impact, I think.
And this declaration and sort of the media attention that has received.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I might just say a few things by way of closing this panel with thanks for that answer. I love the fact that multiple people have asked about the messy assumptions that people make about consciousness, and I think that is really important for understanding how to bridge science and policy. And one observation from the past decade or so for me of studying animal minds, and this is a point that Jonathan and especially Kristen and others have made in their work is that studying animal minds can be a way to unearth assumptions about consciousness and specifically about human consciousness that might have previously been hidden for us. We might make these assumptions because we index to our own example about what pleasure, pain, happiness, suffering, hope, fear, love, hate are. And then we go and study these phenomena in other animals, which are similar to us in some ways, different from us in other ways, and we realize they have versions of this too, and it really does call into question the assumptions we were making all along about the essential nature of these psychological capabilities. So I think that studying them in other animals can be good for other animals, but then that can feed back into our understanding about human consciousness and consciousness in general. And just a couple of other brief points. One is, as we all have now said, we do ultimately have to make policy decisions about how to treat other animals, despite ongoing disagreement and uncertainty about the nature of consciousness, about the scope of consciousness in the world. And this is why we took what Jonathan sometimes describes as a theory-light approach to our development of the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness. We did not want to presuppose any particular theory of moral considerability, any particular theory of welfare, even any particular theory of consciousness. We wanted to say, in the most general and minimal possible terms that still have bite, that all vertebrates and many invertebrates have at least a realistic possibility of being conscious in a way that merits consideration of welfare risks. And I think that at least establishes a baseline. And then we can still have lots of disagreement and uncertainty, but it establishes a baseline for considerability, and we hope that we can build on that. So not speaking for everybody, all the signatories have different attitudes, but that was at least the spirit that I think we were trying to bring to the project. Okay. And with that said, thank you so much to Cleo and Katrina for this panel. We have now reached the end of the conference, but we do have a meaningful conclusion, so we ask you to bear with us for just a little while longer, and then we can all go have food and drinks. You have seen presentations and discussion from a dozen of our 39 distinguished initial signatories to the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness. That does leave quite a few additional signatories who are unable to be panelists and for the most part unable to be here in person. So we are not going to be able to equally represent everybody here, though we do see you in the chat and we thank you for being here. Though we do want to have a brief moment where we can represent some of the other signatories, and in order to do that, I want to invite Diana Reese up. Diana Reese is a cognitive psychologist, marine mammal scientist, and professor in the Department of Psychology at Hunter College and at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She is director of the Animal Behavior and Conservation Graduate Program in the Psychology Department of Hunter College. Her research focuses on dolphin cognition and communication, comparative animal cognition, and the evolution of intelligence. She applies her research in advocating for global protection for dolphins and whales, and she is among our initial signatories for this declaration. So please join me in welcoming Diana.
Hi, everybody. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with everybody today, and I thank the organizers for such a stimulating and important conference. I'm going to keep this short because I know we're running late. We have a lot of people who you want to hear from, but I do want to say just a couple of things. I have a lot of notes I started making. I plan to say other things. I'm going to cut all those. I think, first of all, this conference is really important for a lot of reasons. I think it will, this conference and the declaration, I think it will make or offer a sea change in the narrative. I think most people are not thinking that invertebrates and reptiles and amphibians and fishes are doing what we heard about today. So I think these kinds of narratives play very well in the public. I know we've seen this with mammals. Roger Payne, one of my dear colleagues who passed away this year, changed policy when he found humpback whale song. He not only published it in Science magazine, but he made an album. He made a narrative that people could relate to. And I think that getting these narratives out that you've so beautifully talked about today, these are stories that people can wrap their heads around, okay? And it makes us think about the life around us in different ways. So I just want to applaud all you guys for the beautiful talks you've given. You've changed, I think, so many things in the world and how we think about things that were unimaginable. Think about what we've heard about today. It was not even considered that an invertebrate or a fish or a reptile or an amphibian would do what you're talking about today. So let's get those stories out. And I think it's going to be, I suspect there's an adaptiveness to sentience. Animals use information. They can store information. They interpret it. They can use it again. And I think if we just think about the adaptiveness of this, again, whether we use the word sentience or consciousness, I think talking in basic terms to people can really make a difference. So again, I want to just say to everybody, thank you so much for brilliant talks today and all the really important work that you're doing. As Jeff said, not all the signatories for the New York Declaration were able to speak, so I'm just going to turn it over now to Sophia, and I guess we'll hear from them, right? Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Martin Jurfa. I'm a professor of neuroscience at Sorbonne University in Paris, and I'm very pleased to introduce myself and tell you what has been moving me actually into the field of animal consciousness. I've been for many years studying the cognitive capacities of honeybees. Honeybees are amazing creatures with a complex social organization, sophisticated communication codes, and above all, impressive learning and memory capabilities. Our work actually showed these learning and memory capabilities under a different light because we showed capacities that were supposed to be only available in vertebrates or mammals, like for instance, higher order cognition, counting, concept formation, transitivity, and many other forms of learning that we show by using complex learning sets in which stimuli were changing all the time by leaving only a single feature constant. And actually we showed that for solving many of these problems, animals were able to focus on this common feature and to extract it to find a solution to the problems. These actually bring us to the conclusion that these animals have attentional processes, and we actually demonstrate by several other means that there is indeed attention. There are other capacities, like for instance the fact of refusing to enter in complex discriminations when the solution is not so obvious, something similar to processes like metacognition. So these kind of experiments, these kinds of evidence is what actually pushes the idea or moves actually the idea of thinking that there might be some levels of consciousness in these creatures. And therefore, I'm very happy to have or to participate in this journey on the emerging science of animal consciousness. So I congratulate the organizers for this initiative. Thanks very much.
This is Peter Godfrey Smith. Bob Elwood's work had a big effect on my thinking in this area. His work on hermit crabs and other crustaceans, especially in relation to pain or pain-like experiences. These are animals with pretty small nervous systems, and it was surprising what he was able to show. In addition, and more recently, Bruno van Swinderen's work on flies, looking at attention, active sleep, a range of different very suggestive phenomena in flies has also really begun to affect my thinking. And before that, of course, it was time in the sea with octopuses and cuttlefish, the large brain cephalopods that got me thinking about invertebrates in a very different way.
Hello. This is Bruno van Swinderen talking to you from University of Queensland in Australia. I think the single experiment that made the biggest impact on me on thinking about invertebrate consciousness is the octopus dreaming. This is from Sam Ryder's lab recently, but also by Teresa Iglesias in cuttlefish and Siddhartha Ribeiro in octopus as well. the pattern colorations that happen during this active sleep stage are just amazing. They seem to recreate waking patterns, but the animal is disconnected from the outside world and in a vulnerable sleeping state. That the octopus might be dreaming and that other invertebrates might be also having a similar active sleep stage, for me, is a very convincing evidence that there is some rudimentary form of consciousness in these animals.
Hi everyone, I'm Yossi Yovel from Tel Aviv University, and my lab studies bat behavior using miniature GPS devices. A few years ago, we showed that bats can rely on cognitive maps in order to navigate in their environment, and that while doing so, they memorize the locations of dozens of fruit trees. New data, currently under review, suggests that the bats also keep track of the time that passed since they last visited a tree, and that they also follow the phenology of preferable fruit trees. Altogether, these findings suggest that bat decision-making is a complex process that takes multiple factors into account and weighs them based on various mental maps.
Hi, my name is Liad Mudrik and I'm joining you from Tel Aviv University. I want to first thank the organizers for this important initiative. I wish I could be there with you. We were asked to name one single study that made a difference with respect to consciousness in animals, and I failed that task miserably. I cannot name one study, although I can take you back to a video I've seen at the time, which made me quite confident that animals do have consciousness. And this is one where you see this baby chimp playing, looking at himself in the mirror for the first time and clearly enjoying and experimenting and having a very intense experience, conscious experience, I would say. But that's, of course, only the starting point of this journey. I think our biggest question is, where do we draw the line, where consciousness starts and ends? And I think that is something that will take a lot of time and many more studies for us to realize. But I think that we have enough evidence at this point to conclude that we are definitely not the only conscious creatures in this universe.
Hey everyone, my name is Professor Colin Brown and I'm coming to you from Macquarie University in Sydney. Some of the most compelling evidence that fish are sentient comes from the recent studies in understanding cognitive bias in fishes and the underlying mechanisms. In the classic paradigm, pessimistic animals with negative affective states tend to avoid novel ambiguous stimuli, whereas optimistic animals with positive affective states tend to approach them with expectation that they will be rewarding. Recent work from Rui Oliveira's lab in Portugal suggests that the underlying mechanism in fishes mirrors those in mammals. Scientists are now using this approach to improve the welfare status of farm animals, and we've been repeatedly using this approach in fishes as well. I have a student right now that's working on this process in sharks. So we now know that fish have emotions, and that emotions change the way they make decisions and interact with the world. Moreover, we've known which parts of the brain are responsible for motion and memory in fishes for over a decade. Perhaps even more amazing is that many of the drugs that we've been using and designed to work on human disorders like stress and anxiety also work in fish, and that's because the underlying hormones and the neural transmitters are almost identical.
Hello, my name is David Edelman. I'm a senior research scientist at KEFRES, which is a private research foundation based in Naples, Italy. I'm also a visiting scholar in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Dartmouth College. What really started me down the road to thinking about consciousness in an invertebrate, specifically the octopus, were the early experiments by Graziano Fiorito at the Stazione Zoologica in Naples that showed, I believe at least, the presence of observational, or as some people refer to it, social learning in the octopus. The idea that an octopus could observe another octopus solving a problem, or perhaps getting punished by an aversive stimulus, and then either solve the problem themselves in effectively no trial learning, or avoid the noxious stimulus without even coming near it.
My name is Stephen Harnad. Jonathan Birch has asked us, what experiment has made the biggest difference to your views about animal consciousness and why? I have to reply that for me, there isn't one. For me, it has been as evident that the other animals feel and can suffer as that other humans feel and can suffer. It was so obvious about the mammals and birds and fish that I stopped eating them when I was 17. When the evidence grew that the other vertebrates and even invertebrates too feel, that was just déjà vu. What troubles me is that the obvious fact that mammals and birds and fish feel has not yet done much to prevent human beings from hurting them. So although it's hard to imagine, amidst all this, what difference scientific evidence that a katydid does feel can make, we should try, because it does matter to the katydid.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to highlight a study that I found to be very interesting in the context of sentience and the experience of pain in so-called lower animals. This is a discovery of the signaling of danger by honeybees described in the following paper. As many of you would know, honeybees use a dance language to indicate the location of an attractive food source to their nestmates in the hive. This is the so-called waggle dance, in which the bee, marked here with 2 white dots, waggles her abdomen as she moves forward in a straight line. The waggle phase indicates, symbolically, the distance and the direction in which a recruited bee should fly to reach the food source. This new study has found that bees can also signal the presence of danger at this site to prevent other bees from visiting it. A bee that has been attacked and injured by, say, a predatory spider at a flower that she has recently visited will headbutt and stop another bee from dancing if the dancer happens to be signaling that site as an attractive feeding location. This image from a video shows a dancing bee and a headbutter. Interestingly, the probability of generating this stop signal increases with the severity of the injury or threat. It is difficult to picture this warning signal as a simple behavioral reflex, with no conscious awareness of danger and no experience of pain. Thus, even creatures like bees may be more than just simple, unthinking and unfeeling automatons. Thank you for your attention.
My name is Nikki Clayton. I'm Professor of Comparative Cognition in the Department of Psychology at the University of Cambridge. I don't think there's a single recent experiment that's made the biggest impact on my views about animal consciousness. I think it's a suite of experiments because converging evidence is to bear on the problem are, for me, the most convincing. But I do think recent work on magic effects, showing how certain animals, such as jays and monkeys, are fooled by some effects and not others, is quite revealing. What we find is that in the case of jays, they're fooled by magic effects where the magician uses their hand in a concealing movement a bit like a wing. They're not fooled by ones that require opposable thumbs. Monkeys that don't have opposable thumbs are fooled by the same things as jays. Monkeys with opposable thumbs are fooled by all the same things as human beings. So the kinds of fingers and thumbs or wings that we have not only shape the way in which we can manipulate objects, but the way in which we interpret what we think we saw and what we think we remembered. That's a special kind of awareness that I think is relevant to this debate.
My name is Anil Seth. I'm Professor of Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience at the University of Sussex, where I also direct the Sussex Center for Consciousness Science. I'm very happy to be signing this new declaration about animal consciousness. The time is right to take seriously the realistic possibility of conscious experiences in species, some of them quite distant from humans, primates, and other mammals. Now, this declaration does not try to legislate which other animals definitely have and definitely do not have consciousness. It says that we should take the possibility very seriously, and we know enough to do that. And importantly, just because we don't have a consensus theory of consciousness and just because we don't know exactly how consciousness happens, well, this doesn't mean we can't make educated, best guesses about the presence and nature of consciousness in other species. And this is an important part of the dialogue, the discourse that we're having in society about animal welfare. Now, for me, the most interesting animals, far from us, are creatures like cephalopods, the octopus, the squid. They have very different neurobiology, And perhaps they experience themselves and their world in very, very different ways. And for me, this is very exciting to imagine what it might be like to be a cephalopod. But it's more than cephalopods. There may be conscious experiences happening in a very wide range of non-human animals. And we need to take this seriously, and this is why I'm very happy to support this declaration.
If Jonathan and Kristen could join me for just the closing statement. So thank you all so much to everybody for being here with us today. Again, all the speakers, all the attendees, everybody online, all the signatories for being a part of this project over the past several months, all of those calls, negotiating the language and fine-tuning everything. We really, really do appreciate it. I also want to briefly thank, again, our sponsors of this event. So this event was hosted by the NYU Mind, Ethics, and Policy Program and the NYU Wild Animal Welfare Program, with co-sponsorship from NYU Animal Studies, the Center for Bioethics, and the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness. And it was organized by the three of us, but almost all of the logistical work was done by two people and mostly one person. And I said I would thank her 3 times, so this is going to be the third. And I know that you don't love to be the center of attention, but we are going to ask that both Sophia and Tony come up here for a second so that we can all thank you properly.
Yes, I don't want to miss my own chance to thank Tony and Sophia. I can't let Jeff get all the pleasure of doing this. The work they've done on this event is absolutely incredible. I never imagined when the three of us were sitting around drafting this relatively short text that people would be working nights and weekends to create a launch event that would make this text into a declaration. And you did this. This is your achievement. Thank you so much. It's incredible.
Would you like to say anything? Okay. Let's have some wine and beer. All right.